Before she was a headline, she was just a woman standing in a kitchen in the Ozarks, a pot boiling, 4 boys yelling, a husband who'd long since run out of patience. The house was small, the air was heavy, the choices were thinner than the soup on the stove. Arizona Donnie Clark Barker, Ma, wasn't born a monster. She was born poor, and a place and time that punished women for being anything but quiet. But history didn't want a monster, it wanted a villain. When the FBI stormed her Florida hideout in 1935, they claimed she was the criminal mastermind behind one of America's most dangerous gangs, a gray-haired matriarch who plotted kidnappings and murders while knitting in the corner. But what if that wasn't true? What if Hoover needed a story, not a truth? And what if Ma Barker, the so-called gang queen, was really just a mother who lost control of the world she tried to hold together? I'm Becca. This is Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt, Episode 4. The mother of all lies, Ma Barker. Born in 1873 in the Ozarks of Missouri, her parents were sharecroppers. Her childhood, an apprenticeship in survival. By 19, she married George Barker, a restless man who never found steady work. They drifted between Arkansas and Oklahoma, chasing wages that always ran out. 4 sons followed: Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, called Doc, and Fred. They weren't born bad, but they, like their mother, were born poor. And poverty, especially in early 20th century America, had a way of bending morality until crime looked like opportunity. When the boys got in trouble, Ma didn't scold them, she defended them. To her, the police were corrupt. The laws were unfair. In time, that belief became the family's religion. The world had wronged them, so why play by its rules? It started small: petty thefts, stolen cars, backroom hustles, but in the Barker family, small sins had a way of growing. Herman, the eldest, was the first to go bad. He was handsome, reckless, and desperate to impress. He drifted towards crime the way a moth drifts towards heat. By his early 20s, he was robbing banks across Oklahoma and Missouri with a crew that operated out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Joplin, Missouri. He dressed sharp, smoked constantly, and carried himself like a movie gangster of his day, the kind who smiled before pulling the trigger. But the glamour did not last. In 1927, after a botched robbery in a police chase near Wichita, Kansas, Herman was cornered. Rather than being taken alive, he turned the gun on himself. The newspaper said suicide. Ma Barker said murder. She told everyone who listened that the police had gunned down her boy in cold blood. It was the first fracture, the moment she decided the system was her enemy. Lloyd followed not long after. He served in the army, came home with medals and discipline, but discipline did not feed you in the Depression. He fell in with bootleggers, running whiskey and robbing stores across the state line. By 1922, he was in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, doing time for bank robbery. Inside, he met the kind of men who turned petty crooks into professionals. When he finally got out, he'd lost the part of himself that still believed in going straight. Then came Doc, Arthur Barker, hot-headed, impulsive, and more violent than his brothers. He'd do a job one week and spend the next in a brothel or gambling den, burning through the take. Doc had no patience for planning, no instinct for caution, but he had a loyal streak, especially to Fred, the youngest. Fred was quiet, charming, and dangerously impressionable, the kind of man who mistook recklessness for courage. When the Barker boys joined forces in the early 1930s, America's falling apart. Banks were failing, farms were dying, and lawmen were stretched thin across the Midwest. The Barker brothers didn't invent crime, they adapted to it. Bank robbery was still a thrill, but the new money was in kidnapping. After the Lindbergh baby case, ransoms became the dark currency of the Depression. It was cleaner, faster, and often deadlier. Doc and Fred fell in with a rotating cast of Midwest outlaws: the Holden Keating gang, the Karpis crew, anyone willing to split a score. In time, they met a man who would change their fate, Alvin Karpis. Karpis was everything the Barkers weren't. He was methodical. He was calm. He was brilliant under pressure. He kept ledgers, cased banks for weeks, and planned each job like a military operation. If the Barkers brought chaos, Karpis brought control. Fred idolized him, and Ma trusted him, which was saying something. Under Karpis's influence, the Barker gang evolved into one of the most efficient criminal syndicates in the Midwest. They moved through a circuit of safe houses: Chicago, St. Paul, Kansas City, Missouri, cities where local law enforcement looked the other way for a cut of the ransom. They were disciplined, dangerous, and suddenly rich. And wherever Fred went, Ma went too. She packed up her few possessions, a Bible, a photograph of her boys, and a small bag of clothes, and followed them from hideout to hideout. She cooked, she cleaned, she played cards with the men and read scripture when the whiskey ran out. To the gang, she was Ma, a mascot, a housekeeper, a reminder that even outlaws came from somewhere. She was not the planner. She wasn't even trusted with details. But her presence, her blind devotion, made the Barker name a single, inseparable word: Ma and the boys. And that's how proximity turned into guilt. By being there, by loving them, she became part of the myth. By 1934, America was tired of blood, but addicted to it as well. The Great Depression had turned gangsters into celebrities. John Dillinger's grin was splashed across every front page. Bonnie and Clyde were dead, but their legend was growing. Babyface Nelson had gone out in a hail of bullets. And in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover was watching his headlines slip away. But he built the Bureau on promises: modern policing, federal muscle, clean victories. But the truth was messier. Dillinger had humiliated the FBI twice before they finally shot him outside of the Biograph Theater. Nelson had taken down 2 agents before dying himself. Pretty Boy Floyd, the Robin Hood of the Ozarks, was gunned down in a field before he could ever surrender. Each of those cases made the Bureau look reactive, not heroic. Hoover needed a clean win, and he needed it fast. Enter the Barker Karpis gang. They weren't as glamorous as Dillinger or as photogenic as Bonnie and Clyde, but they were organized. They were efficient, and they were terrifyingly good at vanishing. Operating out of St. Paul, Minnesota, then the safest city in America for criminals, and they bribed cops. They paid off politicians and rented houses under false names. They were smart. In early 1934, they pulled off the kind of job that made even seasoned gangsters nervous: the kidnapping of Edward Bremer, the well-connected president of Commercial State Bank. Bremer was not just any banker. He was a friend of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. When he was snatched off of the street, the White House took notice. The gang held him for 21 days. They fed him, and they gave him blankets, even read him the newspaper, all while negotiating his ransom. $200,000 later, roughly $4 million in today's cash, they released him unarmed on a rural road outside Rochester, Minnesota. And guys, you gotta admit, that's impressive for back then. It was the perfect crime. No witnesses, and there was no deaths. But that in itself was a problem. Hoover couldn't celebrate an unsolved kidnapping. He could only chase one. As agents followed the ransom money through the underworld, they began to close in on names: Karpis, Doc, Fred, Barker. But the gang was elusive. They skipped town, rented new hideouts, and changed their cars like they changed their shoes. Then, almost by accident, Hoover found his opportunity: a letter intercepted by investigators that mentioned Ma. It was ordinary, a son writing home. But in Hoover's hands, it became something else. It became a weapon. He began dictating internal memos describing Ma Barker as the criminal genius behind the entire operation, a gray-haired strategist who orchestrated kidnappings and robberies from a rocking chair. The image was irresistible. A woman in her 60s leading killers like an army of sons, the mother of evil, an anti-Madonna. The press devoured it. Newspapers called her Bloody Mama, Hell's Mother, the most vicious woman in America. In truth, there wasn't a shred of evidence she planned a single job, not in witness statements, not in the confessions of her sons, not even in the reports of Hoover's own agents. Alvin Karpis himself, the man that Hoover would one day give the notorious honor of naming public enemy number one, said it plainly. Ma wasn't a criminal. She couldn't plan breakfast, let alone a bank job. But truth and narrative have never been equals. Hoover understood something most men in his position didn't. That perception was power. By turning Ma Barker into a myth, he created the perfect counterweight to the outlaws who made the Bureau look weak. If Dillinger was the devil of American masculinity, then Ma Barker was its fallen mother, proof that evil could be born at home, right under the kitchen cross. It was the story America wanted to believe, that the moral decay of the Depression began not in boardrooms or banks, but in living rooms, in failed mothers, defiant sons, and the collapse of the home itself. Sound familiar? The legend spread faster than the truth could catch up. Hoover's Ma Barker became an archetype. A weaponized morality tale dressed in checkers and gunsmoke. By the time FBI surrounded that Florida home a year later, the myth was already written. All they had to do was pull the trigger and call it justice. On January 16th, in the year of 1935, the FBI closed in on a rental lakeside home in Florida. They called for surrender. Silence answered, then gunfire. The Bureau claimed Ma and Fred returned fire, triggering a 4-hour siege and more than 2,000 rounds. When the smoke cleared, both were dead. Ma's body lay beside a Tommy gun. Hoover's men told reporters she died with a machine gun in her hands. It was perfect propaganda. A gray-haired gangster queen dying in battle, but neighbors swore only Fred fired. Ballistics proved nothing. Maybe she never touched a weapon. Maybe she just sat and waited, a mother surrounded by the ruin of her love. 2 women live in the archives. The legend Hoover sold, ruthless, brilliant, monstrous, and the reality. The reality is she was a poor mother who followed her sons into darkness because she didn't know how to let them go. She was not the boss. She was the believer. Friends called her gentle. She loved music and church socials. She wanted her boys safe, even when they made that impossible. That's not leadership. That's tragedy, folks. J. Edgar Hoover ruled through image. His FBI was built not just on law, but on storytelling. And a lot of people don't realize that. He needed neat categories, heroes and villains, and Ma Barker delivered both. The idea of a mother turned monster thrilled and terrified Depression-era America. It reinforced order. It justified the control. Hoover did pose beside the bullet-riddled house. Meanwhile, newspapers ran photos of her corpse as proof of justice. No one asked for evidence. Most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade, Hoover declared. It was all theater, and America bought a ticket. Every era needs a villain to feel victorious. Ma Barker became America's villain. She embodied every anxiety of the 1930s. poverty, rebellion, and the fear of a woman who stepped outside of their role. We don't forgive mothers who fail at softness. We destroy them for it. Time has a way of peeling back the varnish. Decades after the headlines faded, the FBI's own files, once locked under Hoover's confidential stamp, were quietly declassified. When researchers opened those yellowing folders, the story that emerged was not cinematic. It wasn't even coherent. It was ordinary. Inside were surveillance notes and letters, case reports, and teletype exchanges that told a far smaller, quieter story, one that never would have sold newspapers in 1935. There was no evidence at all that Ma Barker ever handled ransom money. No fingerprints on any weapons, no bank ledgers in her handwriting, no witnesses who could place her at the planning table. What was there was small domestic details, a list of groceries, notes about who needed new shirts, letters to relatives written in shaky script. I don't know about you guys, but reading this, it makes me sick. All I can do is just think of my grandma. In one, she told her sister she was lonely. In another, she worried Fred wasn't eating enough. She signed them the same way every time, with love, Ma. It wasn't the correspondence of a criminal mastermind. It was the paper trail of a woman who'd built her identity around her sons, even as they dragged her further from the life she understood. The Bureau's own post-mortem reports confirmed exactly what eyewitnesses had whispered. Ma Barker's fingerprints appeared on nothing of consequence. Her personal belongings from the Florida house were pitifully mundane. Only a Bible, a few photographs, a small sewing kit, and some cheap costume jewelry. Not a map, not a ransom note, not a single piece of evidence linking her to the crimes Hoover swore that she planned. Even Alvin Karpis, who lived long enough to see the FBI myth unravel, could not stay silent. In his 1971 memoir, On the Rock, 25 Years in Alcatraz, he wrote, "The real boss was Fred. Ma was just there because he wanted her around. She didn't know what was going on." Coming from the man who had every reason to downplay his own guilt, it was a devastating admission, not of Ma's power, but of her powerlessness. Historians who combed through the Bureau's archives decades later found a pattern of omission. Agents had exaggerated her involvement, omitting the lack of direct evidence while inflating the rumors. Internal memos between field officers even showed uncertainty. One agent admitted privately that the mother's role appears to be only domestic, not directive. But once Hoover had spoken, there was no walking it back. The narrative was fixed in stone, even if the foundation was paper thin. The truth was too dull for radio drama or front page headlines. It didn't fit the script that Hoover had written about good men triumphing over an evil woman. Because the real story wasn't about a criminal empire. It was about loyalty and abandonment. It was about a mother who followed her sons across the Midwest out of love and fear of losing the only thing that gave her life meaning. So she never commanded the Barker gang. She contained it. The only constant in a world where loyalty was currency and trust was suicide. And in the end, that love became her undoing. Ma Barker didn't die because she was the mastermind. She died because she was there, because she couldn't stop believing that being a mother meant never walking away. And in Hoover's America, that was guilt enough. By the time her body left Florida, she was not a person anymore. She was a product. Her death marked the end of the public enemy era and the birth of Hoover's legend. If Dillinger was spectacle and Nelson was chaos, Ma Barker was pure propaganda. And propaganda always wins because it gives people the comfort of clarity. But justice is not clean. It never was. Arizona Donnie Clark Barker was a mother, not a mastermind. She raised 4 boys who chose crime and she loved them anyways. Her story isn't about the law and the order. It's about loyalty, blindness, and the human cost of myth making. She died surrounded by her son's sins and the government's lies, caught between devotion and damnation. Maybe she wasn't morally bankrupt. Maybe we were for needing her to be. History called her a monster, but the records tell a smaller story, a mother who couldn't stop being a mother. Arizona Barker died the way she lived, surrounded by her sons, chaos, and caught in a narrative she did not write, and buried beneath the weight of the men who needed her to be a legend. She wasn't the criminal brain of the century. She was collateral damage of a nation desperate for heroes and villains. I'm Becca. This has been Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt, Episode 4, The Mother of All Lies, Ma Barker. Next time, the outlaw who tried to rewrite his own legend, the man who robbed banks, fed farmers, and died for the story America wanted him to tell. Episode 5 is going to be The Gentleman Bandit. Pretty Boy Floyd, my favorite. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If you found the story compelling, follow, rate, and share on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, anywhere you listen. It helps keep these forgotten histories alive. The research and narration, it's done by me, can't you tell? And sources for this episode do include FBI declassified files, On the Rock, 25 Years in Alcatraz by Alvin Karpis, and historical press archives from the St. Paul Pioneer Press and the New York Times.